Welcome to the HC Insider Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. Today we're talking shipping and logistics, primarily focused on the dry bulk world, industrial metals, agricultural products, and many of those things that are going into the energy transition. Are we over the COVID hangover? After stellar years in freight, where do prices stand today and what are the market dynamics? What's going on in inland logistics? And what's the big picture on the challenges and opportunities that face the sector? Our guest is Anton Posner. Anton is the CEO of Mercury Group, an industrial commodity supply chain management and logistics firm. I also want to note that we have an upcoming HC Insider podcast live event, this time on September the 14th in central London. Hosted by Onyx Capital Group, we're discussing the future of oil derivatives and who really prices oil today. The panel consists of myself moderating, Greg Newman, CEO of Onyx Capital Group, Savas Manousos, former head of trading at Cepsa, and former guests Kurt Chapman and Tor Sveland, founder and CEO of Sveland Capital. The event is free, but invitation only, and spaces are limited. So if you have interest in coming along and seeing the panel, please do email me or reach out via LinkedIn. If not, you will be able to hear the panel discussion on a future episode of the podcast. As always, you can really support the show by leaving a positive review on the platform you're listening on. Please also feel free to email me if there are subjects and content that you want covered or you have a particular guest in mind. And finally, as always, I hope you enjoy the episode. Anton, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Paul. Really great to be here and to join. Been looking forward to doing the HC Insider podcast for a while. So
Yeah,
really excited to be here.
Excellent. So we should set the scene. We're talking essentially commodity logistics, both inland and global freight as well, or ocean going, I should say, and primarily focused on industrial commodities, but lots of things flow into that. Let's start, I guess, where I left off the last logistics-focused podcast I did about a year and a bit ago, and we were very much in the sort of post-COVID hangover with snarled ports, extraordinary freight rates, and some question over whether this was structural and systemic or whether it was going to subside eventually. Can you kind of, I guess, set the scene since COVID and kind of where we are today?
Right, as you said, certainly during the pandemic, the supply chain issues in many aspects and many areas of the global logistics and transportation supply chain infrastructure experienced extreme duress, right, during the pandemic. When things started to come back and swing back towards import on a large scale into North America, for example, we saw massive delays, ships coming into ports throughout the country and throughout U.S. and Canada, waiting for sometimes weeks and months for berths, huge delays waiting for empty rail cars to be available, massive truck shortages that drove up the spot and contract truck freight market. So we saw really a large scale chaos, and particularly in the commodity supply chain and industrial commodity supply chain that we work in. Things have moved back towards normal at this point, so we're kind of back to where we were pre-pandemic in a lot of the areas in the supply chain. Yeah.
As you look back at that, sort of the post-game analysis, what was the major factors contributing to that? I mean, a lot of it seemed even at the time was down to labor and then also a sudden onrush of demand. Was there anything more structural there? Where are we at with sort of unions? Where are we at with labor around the world? Can you sort of help us understand kind of why we're heading back towards normality, and if there are any bits that aren't going to go back?
And certainly, there were different factors that contributed in different parts of the supply chain. But let's take the one that was the most talked about. Right, was the port delays at West Coast ports. Right, there was a continual tracking of how many ships were waiting at anchor, for example, off LA Long Beach. For these are container ships waiting to discharge. The infrastructure situation is not easily and readily expandable, right? At a port like Los Angeles Long Beach, they have only a certain amount of berths with cranes that can actually physically handle these container ships. So while you could add more labor to the situation, it doesn't mean that there's going to be more container cranes than instantaneously showing up. So this was a big factor as consumer demand came back really strongly, right? As we were 2021 into 2022, we saw these massive delays with an inability to really adjust what the infrastructure to deal with it, right? So you had a situation where container lines just kept adding more ships calling the same ports onto these services, and container freight was so significant on the Pacific market, for example. So you had container freight for, let's say, a 20-foot container going from China to California pre chaos was maybe in the $1,000 range or less. Then you saw upwards of $30,000 per container just to secure space on a container ship going, and that still meant that probably the container was going to sit on a ship off the coast of California for a month or two waiting for a berth at that point. So a big contributing factor in that particular case was the container lines not spreading their business out to other smaller workable ports and concentrating on these large ports that ended up with pretty significant congestion. So
Mm.
that's now changed, and there's been some movement towards diversifying their portfolio.
Yeah, we're going to go through sort of obviously containers, which some astonishing numbers made last year.
Yeah.
Obviously dry bulk as well, and the inland piece, and then come back
Mhm.
to kind of the future macro picture. Is
Mhm.
just staying sort of on that COVID hangover piece. It seems to me that when you get large periods of inflation, prices are never going to, at least in the medium term, they never really return to where they were. Is there still a post-COVID premium? Especially when you factor in increased labor costs, inflation, and so forth that's happened since.
In transportation markets, in some of the transportation markets, rail freight, for example, has continuously moved upward, right, in several percentage points on average. I'd say what we're seeing on rail freight. However, in other areas, ocean freight, both containerized and dry bulk, break bulk, has significantly dropped over the past several months. So railroads are more monopolistic, right? Less of a liquid market there. So it's more opportunity for railroads to lock in increases that they've gained over the past few years. Whereas the markets where there's more competition, truck freight in North America or bulk ocean freight, containerized ocean freight, where there's more liquid markets, those have suffered the most in terms of reversing any of the gains that they had. Barge freight on the Mississippi River system, for the most part, has moved upwards and locked in some of the increases. I would say that were gained over the pandemic craze, but the railroads really have been able to take most advantage of more permanent increases.
Yeah, yeah, and obviously the story that will unfold we're telling here is also one of the typical shipping cycle where lots of more ships have now entered circulation, the fleet,
Hmm.
unlike perhaps on rail stock. But okay, let's turn to
Right.
ocean freight, and in particular, obviously dry bulk. Before we start
Mhm.
sort of throwing various terminology around, can you just help us? What ships are involved in dry bulk? What are sort of the major routes? Just help set the scene for that for those of us who aren't particularly familiar with some of these things.
Yeah, sure. And we differentiate, tend to differentiate between the terms dry bulk and break bulk. And to help set the scene for that, break bulk is typically coils of steel, bundles of copper cathodes, aluminum ingots, super sacks of minerals, something that you could typically count. If you're looking at it, you can count how many pieces, how many bundles, how many sacks are there, and that's what we typically call break bulk. And dry bulk is materials that are measured in tons that you can't count, like iron ore, coal, grains, right, fertilizer, things like that, where we're talking about tons rather than pieces when we're dealing with account. So just to set the stage right on the differentiation. Break bulk, the steel and metals and super sack and pallets and so forth are typically moving on handy size vessels, and sometimes smaller vessels. These are geared ships, let's say 30,000, 40,000 deadweight carrying capacity, geared ships with cranes on them that are used for handling the cargo on and off the ship. It's your typical ships that are involved in break bulk trade for steel and metals, for example. And then as you start getting into the larger size ship, Supermax, Panamax, Cape size vessels, these are much larger vessels that are engaged in the dry bulk trade, and they're carrying coal and iron ore and grains and other bauxite, alumina in bulk, and so forth, other raw materials. Cape size vessels can range from baby capes that are in the 90 to let's say 110,000 metric ton carrying capacity size, upwards of large capes that can move like 150, 170,000 tons at a time. And those are typically carrying iron ore, coal, large volume mining commodities that are going into, and a big trade for the Cape size vessels would be, say, iron ore from Brazil to China, feeding into the steel mills in China. Sliding back down to the handy size vessels and break bulk shipments, those for steel and metals, you see a lot of those on trades coming out of the Far East, for example, carrying steel plate from Korea into New Orleans, or carrying steel slabs up from Brazil into California for California steel industries, or things like that.
Mm.
That's your typical, break bulk vessels. And of course, these break bulk ships are trading all over the world and different trades with metals, steel, and other break bulk type commodities and goods.
That's fantastic. And then, how, before we talk about sort of where the market's been and where it is today and heading forwards
Yeah.
for the dry bulk side, what is the market structure itself? Do the larger producers own their own vessels? Do these all sit in managed pools, and chartered out? Like, how does the market work?
Sure. One of the guys from our ocean freight team could talk far more in detail than I can on this topic, but I'll give you a little bit of an overview for the audience here. The market consists of players of various sizes, ship owners. So you'll have actual ship owners, companies that actually own their own ships. Then you have ship operators, companies that don't own the ships but time charter them in. Basically, that's a time charter is a long-term or short-term lease of a vessel on a daily rate. And then those companies, those ship operators, operate those ships as if they're the ship owner. And then you have companies that mix both. Like, let's take like the world's largest Oldendorf carriers, right? Hamburg and Lubeck, Germany-based Oldendorf carriers are operating about 700 ships in various sizes, from Cape size down to handies. And out of those 700 ships that they're operating, they own maybe about 100 of those ships, is what they typically say when they give an introduction on Oldendorf, and have about 600 others that are chartered in and being operated by Oldendorf. Sometimes if they're on long-term time charter to a ship operator like Oldendorf, they may change the ship's name and make it like the Helda Oldendorf or something like that. Or sometimes if Oldendorf is just chartering a ship in for a single voyage or a shorter amount of time, they won't bother changing the name. They're not doing something like that. But that's a good example of what you see in the market. And of course, then you have many other ship owners and operators throughout the world, some that just own a couple of ships, that charter their ships into pools, or want to just own a ship and then time charter it out to an operator. They don't want to get involved in trying to piece together parcels or chasing after cargo. These owners want to own a ship and charge a daily hire rate for it, and sometimes not even crew the ship. They may what they call bareboat charter it to a ship operator, who will then crew the ship and operate it and pay for fuel, bunkers, and so forth, and actually manage the ship. So you have a lot of different types of players in that market, but it's a very liquid market. So it lends itself to needing expertise to really cover the entire market and find the right ship owners that that fit the particular piece of business.
Hmm. And also it's I guess a hedgeable market in the sense you've got the freight forward agreements contracts that
Right.
are now available and thriving in this space.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. FFAs, forward freight agreements, traded, and then certainly.
I got that wrong.
Yeah, it's okay. You were pretty close. Who knows? FFAs are very can be a mystery, right? It's not something that a lot of people know about that are actively even involved in working freight every day, right? But these forward freight agreements, the FFAs, traded on the Baltic Exchange. I'm no expert in FFAs, so take it for what it's worth, right? But that's a method, just like any derivatives product, right? It's a product that can be used to hedge freight for a long-term freight book. Now, take a trader, an aluminum trader that's looking to purchase a couple of spot cargoes of aluminum coming out of London Metal Exchange warehouses in Port Keeling, Malaysia, and move to New Orleans to feed into the Midwest premium. They're not going and diving into the FFA market to hedge that freight, right? They're booking that freight on a spot basis. They've locked in the ocean freight. They know what it's going to be. They know where their margin's going to be on the particular trade. But the FFAs come into play when, let's say you're a producer of let's say biomass, right? Large scale wood pellet production going into European power production, and you need to go into a 10-year offtake agreement with a European energy consumer, and that's the type of trade where you may want to hedge the freight so that you have some hedge on it on your freight exposure for that long-term contract, not necessarily going to be able to lock in that ocean freight for that kind of period of time with ship owners. So that's a kind of trade where FFAs can come into play. I'm sure FFA brokers out there would want to have other things to say about the usefulness of those contracts too. So I'll leave it to their expertise to comment at some point when you do the FFA show.
Yeah, there you go. Please write in. Okay, so thanks for that. And that really nicely sets the scene. And it's not actually something we've discussed in detail on this podcast either. So it's great to kind of get that
Yeah.
dry bulk view.
Mm-hmm.
So okay, so where was the market and where is the market today and kind of where's it heading?
This now talking about the break bulk and bulk freight in this case, seeing a fairly flat market. There is really no contango on the futures on the derivatives at this point. Give you an idea, right? We're seeing handy size vessels trading $10,000 a day or less at this point for time charters on these size vessels, or even some of the larger vessels are in the same kind of range. Whereas, rewind back 6 to 12 months ago, in that period, we were seeing these same ships go for $35,000 a day and upwards $40,000 a day at the height of the market, right? So those kind of daily, what we call hire numbers, daily hire is the cost per day for the ship to be on charter or lease, right? Those numbers then translate into detention and demurrage charges that are put into a charter party, into a freight contract, right? So if that ship is sitting at anchor with steel in the Philadelphia area for 2 months waiting for a berth, like there was some ships waiting extreme amount of time, to do that, you're talking about at the height of the market, that was costing somebody $35,000-$40,000 a day to have that ship sit at anchor at that point. So now where we're down the dry bulk market for the handy size and Panamax and Cape size vessels are all down that $10,000 or sub $10,000 a day range, and you got over the next few years about 350 new ships coming out from in shipyard orders coming out into the market. So not a great outlook in terms of being a ship owner with a new building coming out of the market. Yeah.
And that's it. Is it new builds that are really driving that? I mean, how long does it take to build these ships? And I guess is this sort of COVID stock coming online or stock that
It's
are
always
already
it's the
pre-ordered?
drunken sailor principle, right? The market's way up. We got to put ship orders in. Put ship orders in. So a lot of these orders were done during, at the time when the market was skyrocketing. There's a lot of orders going to be coming out of the yards. So that means more opportunity for ship owners to scrap old ships, more inefficient, more fuel guzzling ships. We'll see more of that happening as ships get retired that are not as efficient. But one of the major factors right now in the dry bulk market and what's depressing it is just the lack of a recovery, of the expected recovery in China, right? So iron ore, metallurgical coal, still a massive overglut in housing in China, and now the People's Bank of China, right, starting to talk about potential stimulus there, just the recovery there, which is such a driver of the dry bulk market because of those raw materials, is just not come to pass in the time anyone expected, of course. So that's a major factor.
Is shipping considered sort of a leading indicator or a lagging indicator in these types of things?
That's a good question, right? I mean, it depends on where you start to look, right? If you look at shipping, you then start diving down into, immediately, pretty quickly into what China is consuming in terms of raw materials. But if you're watching construction and raw material consumption in China, it will lead you very quickly into a depressed freight market, right? If there's a lack of steel making and metal smelting and so forth, like we're seeing. So, yeah, so it's kind of maybe chicken and the egg type thing there, right? Is it a leading indicator? It's leading if you start with it, I suppose, right? But it's definitely a flag, that's for sure.
Yeah. So one other just final aspect, we're going to move on to some of the macro trends about deglobalization, which also is going to have an impact on friendshoring and all that piece.
Mm-hmm.
One of the major stories, obviously, of late last year or early this was scandals around missing inventory and that piece. How, if anything, has that affected the markets? Has that sort of changed some of the compliance aspects? Is that sort of playing into these markets at all?
It's a good point, right? I mean, there's been just one after another commodities, finance scams, and so forth, right? The biggest one over the past few months has been the traffickers' fake nickel. I think 1,019 or so containers of alleged nickel turned out to be rocks or steel discs of so forth, right?
If you were
So
lucky.
seeing this. If you were lucky, right, or the joke I made was Chuck E. Cheese tokens is another way to put it, right? But then someone corrected me and said, "No, Anton, Chuck E. Cheese tokens actually have value, so you can't relate it exactly to what trafficker got in the containers." But right now, I wouldn't say we're seeing that having an effect necessarily on the freight markets, but certainly having an effect on the trade finance markets. And this starts to veer into an area where I'm certainly not an expert, right? But I'm on the board of ITFA, International Trade and Forfeiting Association, which is a trade finance organization, and it's a big topic for us at ITFA, a big part of the conference that we held in Miami in May, talking about this. But you've seen major banks like EBN AMRO, BNP Paribas, move out in significant ways of the physical commodity finance space, right, over the past few years. And you have to wonder, right, how much of this fraud, of which the trafficker's $500 million problem is only one story of many, right? Another massive one, right, of course, was the Greensill scandal with GFG Group, Liberty Steel Group, and Credit Suisse, which is a complete mess, of course, putting Credit Suisse in jeopardy and now being acquired by UBS, right? So while I wouldn't relate it directly to the freight market, I mean, it certainly doesn't help to have more players withdrawing from financing physical commodity trade. The fraud issues have certainly had a major effect on banks and financiers that are financing physical commodity trade. We do collateral management for several banks, right? It's part of what we do as a Mercury Group to help mitigate the risk of commodity trade finance fraud. But yeah, it's there's going to be more stories in the future, just a matter of time.
The HC Insider podcast is brought to you by HC Group, a retained search, intelligence and advisory firm focused solely on the global energy and commodity sector. With 6 locations across Asia, Europe and the Americas and over 50 consultants. To find out more, go to our website, hcgroup.global. There, you can also sign up for our HC Insider content for more interviews and white papers on relevant trends and talent impacts in the commodities world.
Okay, well, so moving on to containers, and I guess we don't need to do the same deep dive as most people will be more familiar with that. But certainly at the FT conference in Lausanne in March, it was the talk of the town, and some incredible eye-watering profits made by container shippers in the wake of last year. Can you just give us some sense of where the market, where you already have, right, this $30,000 number to ship a container from China to LA, and now down at 3.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's the same story of new supply coming in, but the profits were unbelievable last year, right?
Yep, exactly. It was a good time to be an equity stakeholder in a container line, right? The profits were certainly they weren't shy about reporting the profits, were they? At the same time, the same time, shippers were waiting. I mean, you put aside the cost, right? What the cost was, to pay $30,000 for one container to load on a ship in Hong Kong or Shanghai to get to Los Angeles just to secure space, right? So to do that and then to read in the market news simultaneously of the container lines reporting extreme profits was it was a little bit hard for people to swallow right at that point, and it certainly played into the narrative that the container lines were were gouging. Now, the container lines, of course, had increased costs at this point. Those ships waiting off the coast of California for a month and a half or 2 months to discharge, that comes at a pretty significant cost. So it's not as if there weren't increased overhead costs for the container lines at the same time that those freight costs were skyrocketing. But yeah, it was how well the container lines were getting the message across that they weren't just gouging the shipping market is a story that probably will still need to be told at some point.
Yeah, well, I think Maersk, CMA, CGM, we're talking in the tens of billions of dollars profit, and I think the sector overall last year was sort of, 300. I mean, it was, people can Google it. It's just a sort of, that story hasn't sort of been told, but it's sort of fascinating. I mean, was that sort of just a unicorn year, and things are back down to normal, and and what's sort of driving that?
Yeah, I think it was a unicorn year, although just like as I think we're going to start seeing in weather and climate patterns, I'm afraid of how many more unicorns we're going to see in the future, right? We saw a lot of things in the past couple of years that have never seen before, right? Record drought in the Midwest contributed to just a crazy barge market last fall in the middle of grain season, historic. In 30 years of me being in the business, I've never seen anything like that. And that certainly goes for what we saw in the ocean freight markets, both the container and break bulk markets. Ships with steel waiting a month and a half in Delaware River at anchor to discharge steel, or this extreme waiting time for these container ships is not something we've ever seen. It's up to the container lines when it comes to the containerized business to, as I mentioned earlier, to diversify their port operations, right? This model of building bigger and bigger container ships. Take for 1992, when I got out of New York Maritime College and went to work for Neptune Orient Lines, which is now American President Lines. I was doing container stowage at Port Newark. We were working 6,000 TEU ships at that point, approximately. And TEUs are 20-foot equivalent units. That means a 6,000 TEU ship means a ship that could carry 6,000 20-foot containers, or a combination of 20-foot and 40-foot containers of this, using that size. Now you have ships, that are just massively larger than this, right? 25,000 TEU container ships that are so much bigger. And when you loading and discharging these massive ships at these ports that have not grown in any significant way in the past 20 years, you got what you got, which is massive congestion, more volume being shoved down the same pipeline and a pipeline that hasn't expanded. So, a ship that shows up carrying 6,000 TEUs can be knocked out maybe in a day in a particular port. Now you're talking about a ship that needs several days and more cranes and more space, right? Just a massive amount of space to lay out all these containers in the yard. And then those containers need to be loaded to trucks, and those containers need to be loaded to rail cars for unit trains to move out. And the infrastructure just hasn't kept up on the inland side, hasn't kept up with the size of these massive container ships going into these ports. So, yeah, needs to be a rethinking there.
So thanks for that. And a note to the listeners, we did an episode dedicated to the container shipping market with Peter Sand back in April 2022. And he actually, I certainly called the fact that this was a transient up and that we would expect things to turn to normal, even though at that time, I think, it seemed like it would go on forever. So I would refer people to that episode 92. On the inland stuff, just in the interest of time, I guess there's one particular aspect I want to bring out, and that is really that we're sort of seeing the same pattern, which is rates are sort of gone from sky high to fizzle this year, and we're expecting sort of the harvest. We're recording this in mid-July, so a couple of weeks behind, but we're expecting the harvest numbers to come out, and we're expecting yields in North America to be pretty low. Can you just talk to that story a little?
As the harvest time approaches, we start getting in what we call grain season in the U.S. inland barge market. The barge market covers the inland river system, Mississippi River, Ohio River, and other tributaries, Illinois River and Waterway, and so forth. During this time, from August through November, what's called grain season, it's typical for the spot barge market to bump upwards and to move up. Typically, a few bucks per ton on barge freight northbound because the barge lines like to position their barges. If they need to, they'll move them empty northbound to take advantage of southbound grain and inflated rates during that time. So this always has an effect on the northbound market, which is what we're typically working in for import steel or metals and other commodities. Barge lines don't want their barges stuck in St. Louis for 3 weeks waiting to unload rebar, when they can have that empty barge up in the upper Miss in Minnesota, loading grain out at a significant premium. So this is pretty typical. Last year, grain season 2022, we had a more robust export grain market with Russia and Ukraine both coming out of the European grain markets. We were seeing more grain moving out to Europe, I believe. That contributed to a strong grain season last year. That, coupled with this perfect storm of this historic drought in the Midwest, where we saw river levels drop to all-time lows and barges going aground at various points of the river system. So we saw really, I think it may not be too inflammatory to use the word ludicrous market last year, to the point where we booked a few barges during that time at $90 a ton, $90 per short ton northbound up into Missouri, a market that would typically be in the maybe $8 to $9 per short ton range for annual contracts. So, I mean, a tenfold increase during spot rates last October. Things have come back down to earth. The barge market right now is nowhere near as tight as it was during that drought. And the reason that drought contributed to the market going up, if it's not obvious, right? If you can only load a barge to 7 feet draft instead of its typical 9 foot, then you need a lot more barges to handle the same tonnage. And therefore, you're taking a lot more barges out of the market during that time, making them more scarce and therefore driving up the market. And that's what we were seeing during that time frame. Now, as you said, Paul, we're hearing that what's coming up in terms of grain season may not be as strong as barge lines may hope for. We're seeing spot rates right now going into September, October. Nothing that's as dramatic, anywhere near as dramatic as it was last year at this point. So we may be on the edge right now of a grain season that may end up being fairly disappointing for the barge lines in terms of increased revenue during this time. So there has been years where the grain season has been so depressed that spot rates during grain season actually have dropped below where annual contract rates were negotiated for the entire year back in the early days of the year, or the end of the previous year. So while I don't think we're going to see that situation, it looks like we may be seeing a less than lackluster grain season at this point for the barge market.
Yeah, and it kind of points to the volatility that you're coming. We're dealing with lots of variables here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Drought, flooding, crop yields, high, low. It's certainly a lot of complexity to managing it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to just get a few words from you on Mercury,
Mm-hmm.
but before we sort of wrap up, the same triumvirate of trends are affecting every aspect of the commodities market. And I think about every episode that we've done, it sort of, in the end, it sort of boils down to one or combination of the three of deglobalization,
Mm-hmm.
energy transition, and digitization that are, that's creating all this volatility and uncertainty and so forth. Where, from a macro picture, do you think sort of the industrial commodity freight world is sitting? I guess especially, you've got this pull from energy transition for more material, more raw material moving to build this incredible supply chain or infrastructure that we need to achieve the energy transition, but at the same time rapidly changing freight routes as the world sort of carves itself into blocks, or blocketization, as Jeremy Shapiro called it on an episode or two ago. Can you just give us your sort of sense on that and the complexity now that is needing to be managed?
I think it's an exciting time, right? We're seeing a few unique factors here, right? The end of a global pandemic, not ramping up China, right? And then this energy transition and the need for more raw materials, copper, nickel, right? Other battery metals and raw materials that feed into this energy transition. So what we're seeing right now is just a market in flux, right? Everything is up in the air. It seems like a lot's up in the air and hasn't yet settled down, right? We're seeing higher interest rates, right? An attempt by the U.S. Federal Reserve to cool inflation. There's a lot of moving parts right now, and companies that are adjusting and flexible and nimble are going to be the ones that are going to be able to take advantage of where new trade routes start to crop up. And it's going to be a challenge, right, for companies that, particularly the ones in asset-based companies, right, that have fixed facilities, right, that just cannot be as adaptive, that are going to have a challenge, right, or that are not paying attention and not adjusting quickly. But we have additional factors of onshoring of production. I think I mentioned to you, Paul, when we were speaking the other day, we're actively bringing in materials now, construction materials and steel, for new manufacturing plants in North America, that in semiconductor production and so forth, right? Things that we've never seen before. At the same time, that there's a lot of now attention. Finally, the world is starting to realize, right, that we can't do all of this without the necessary natural resources and raw materials to be mined and refined, right, and smelted and made into useful materials. It's not enough to just pull raw ore out of the ground, but it actually has to be refined, right, at that point. And that's where things get to be far more challenging, right? These are not the cleanest operations. So we're seeing world very much in transition, and supply chains and transportation infrastructure, right, all with a big question mark, hovering overhead.
But including the technologies around even the infrastructure itself, right? Ships, are they going to be compatible with, hydrogen, biofuels, trains, electrification, long haul road? I mean, it's just a very complex picture, isn't it? And I guess the point being that, as we sort of keep coming back to, the outcome is ultimately going to be volatility, especially when you layer in the environmental effects that are so profoundly affecting these markets, especially at the more micro level, the inland level.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, you take the shipping, ocean freight market, right? The ships. Right now, there's an enormous amount of discussion and energy, right, being put into determining what the fuel of the future is going to be for ships. I think today, one of the container lines announced the new building of a new ammonia or hydrogen powered vessels, right, as they're looking at alternative fuels, particularly to comply with what's coming in the European Union on emissions for ships. I think in 2024 coming up there. So there's going to be some driving factors in regulation that are going to have a pull on these markets, in addition to this reshaping of global supply chains. I mean, throw Russia-Ukraine war into the mix too, right? And how that affected agriculture markets and ocean freight markets in the Black Sea and Mediterranean, right? It's easy to come up with a number of just existential factors, right, that were just unthinkable, right, 10 years ago, perhaps.
Yeah. Even at some point, what flagged ships will be able to go where, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of the end result of some of the strands of deglobalization that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, you've been very gracious with your time. It'd be great to obviously just get a few words on Mercury and kind of what differentiates you and it from sort of the other options there are to fixing your cargoes and products.
Absolutely, yeah. So we described the Mercury Group as we're a fiduciary for our clients, right? So tend to use that financial phrase to describe us. We're a non-asset based company, right? So we work for our clients. We don't pretend to be a ship owner. We don't pretend to be a barge line or a railroad. Our job as a fiduciary for our clients is managing their supply chain to the best of our ability and to find the right fit for their business, whether it be barge lines, trucking companies, railroads, ports, and stevedoring operations, ship owners. So we're never steering our clients towards our own assets, right? There's a lot of companies that are asset-based logistics companies, of course, right? Their job is to drive business towards the assets that they've invested in and to make use of them. Our job is completely different, right? What differentiates us, we are strictly an advocate and therefore prosecuting our clients' needs in the market entirely. So we take our responsibility as a fiduciary very seriously, and therefore it keeps us in what I would like to say in a different league, right, compared to asset-based logistics companies or companies that pretend to be a carrier and so forth. But we work on a transparent basis for our clients, and that's what makes us different.
Well, fantastic. Well, as you said at the start, it's been a long time coming. We've known each other for a long, long time. And, I hope to have you back on in a year or two and we'll see where we're at and see whether some of the predictions of volatility play out.
Absolutely. Yep. Looking forward to that, Paul. And I'm sure we'll have some more crazy topics to talk about next time too.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the show, please give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. To find out more about HC Insider and HC Group, a search and advisory firm dedicated to the commodity markets, visit our website at www.hcgroup.global. There you can find out more about our services and our offices around the world. There you can also find more content, from interviews to insight pieces to more podcasts focused on the commodity value chains. Thanks again for listening.